Welcome to my second lecture in place. After my first lecture, I'm not sure who received more attention, Antonio Vivaldi or our cat Sylvester. But I've invited both Sylvester and you to this presentation on Frédéric Chopin. Chopin embodied the ideals of the Romantic Age and elevated piano performance and composition to new heights. As I usually do, let's settle into the sound world of Chopin. Now, what you're about to hear is not an authentic work of Chopin, rather a song adapted from his Etude in E major. The thing is that Chopin's piano music is often so essentially vocal, this song just takes advantage of a quality that was already there in abundance. Please welcome soprano Josephine Stoplenberg to your video screen. So, I mentioned that Chopin was a leading exponent of the Romantic Age in music. I realize that we often toss around these terms such as classical or romantic in regards to stylistic periods in Western art music, and yet not everyone agrees on them or is necessarily even familiar with them. So, I'm going to go wading into these murky waters. A disclaimer. My viewpoint here will be pointedly Eurocentric. For instance, what we call the Baroque period, when that was happening in Europe, many fine composers in the New World, in Mexico and Latin America, were writing in a style that we associate with the Renaissance. So, geographic locations certainly have a bearing on all this. Here are my rough definitions of stylistic periods. You will see the Renaissance, 1400 to 1625, the early Baroque, from 1600 to 1700. Late Baroque, I put from 1700 to 1767. That's the year that Telemann died. The Classic period, from roughly 1740 to 1827, 1828. Those are the years that Beethoven and Schubert died, respectively. It's important to note that these first four periods, Renaissance, Early Baroque, Late Baroque, and Classical, are what we call periods of common practice. This means that within a certain range, everyone composed along the same stylistic norms. One instance, I would say, would be that the key of C-sharp minor was there for anyone in the Renaissance to use, but for lots of reasons having to do with what was acceptable at the time, no one did. Now, of course, there are trailblazers in each epoch, like Palestrina in the Renaissance, Monteverdi in the late Renaissance, early Baroque, and Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven in the later classical period. But even these greats grew out of stylistic norms that they inherited. That seems to be one reason, I think, that so much great music comes from these periods. There is a lot of efficiency in waking up each morning to know what style you're in, though of course they didn't think of it that way. Next, I show the Romantic period, which is from before 1810 through, I put 1849. People often describe any lush, tonal, or expressive music as being romantic, but many other elements were wrapped up in true romanticism, including an embracing of the purity and beauty of nature, certain supernatural elements, think of Weber's Der Freischütz or Berlioz's Symphonie Fantastique, and a longing for freedom. This latter ideal was associated with a number of actual political revolutions in Europe, many of which ended around 1849, the very year that Chopin died. Now you'll see that I have the somewhat provocative date of 1740 stuck in there as the possible beginning for the Romantic period. While most people might think that's crazy, I have good reason for saying it. The 1740s were when Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach, the second son of J.S. Bach, was beginning to write some of his greatest works, pieces with unabashedly romantic leanings. I recently conducted a concerto by C.P.E. Bach that had an unbelievably expressive and even romantic slow movement, and I've done a number of pieces by him like that. C.P.E. Bach wrote lots of works in this style that was called the Empfindsam Stil, or the sensitive style. And it was very much about expression like you hear a century later in Chopin. And who did C.P.E. Bach influence greatly? Well, the young Joseph Haydn, who later in life influenced Beethoven, who usually gets the credit for ushering in true romantic music. So, there you have it. Finally, I show the post or late Romantic period from 1849 through the 20th century, because that style lasted, in some cases, a long time, depending on the composer. And the modern period, 1894 through the present. 1894 happens to be the date that Debussy wrote his Prelude to the Afternoon of a Faun, still, in my opinion, a rather modern piece in many ways. And you have Charles Ives in our own country writing some very modern music, though mostly in isolation. So in these final periods, lots of widely diverging musical styles exist side by side. So they are not what we call periods of common practice. Of course, there are lots of sub-periods within these main groups, like Rococo in the early classical period and Impressionism in the beginning of what I call the modern period. Now, if somebody gives you a quiz on standard definitions of these periods, don't cite my examples, because textbooks tend to give you more clear-cut demarcations of dates. But that's not really how history works. You see, most of my periods overlap. I can guarantee you that a violinist did not go to rehearsal in 1760, sit down by his stand partner, and say, "Hey, did you see the newspaper today? Baroque period's over. Yep, we're in the classical period now." Anyhow, in the very small chance you have not changed to Netflix about 5 minutes ago, I hope this sheds some light on musical periods and terminology. Now, Chopin. Frédéric Chopin was born about 29 miles from Warsaw in a town called Zależała Wola. This is the house where he was born and christened Frédéric Franciszek Chopin, which later was modified to the French, Frédéric François Chopin. Some uncertainty arose about Chopin's actual birth date, when 50 years after his birth, a baptismal certificate was found that showed February 22nd, 1810 as his birthday. Both Chopin and his mother always said it was March 1st, and it is now believed that someone incorrectly placed his date as 1 week earlier when the certificate was recorded. And March 1st is accepted now as the correct date. Chopin's father's family was completely French. His father, Nicholas, was from the Lorraine region of France. When Nicholas was a boy, a Polish king had taken refuge in this region. And this could be one influence why, at the age of 16, Nicholas left France for good to seek his fortunes in Poland, possibly also to avoid being drafted into the French Revolutionary Army. He adopted his new homeland of Poland completely and viewed his nationality as Polish from then on, something that would have a significant effect on his children. Revolution was in the air, and Nicholas was ultimately called into the Polish National Guard and became a captain. While working as a French tutor for a well-to-do family, he shared a table at meals with one of the housekeepers, Tekla Justina Krasnowska. After 4 years of meal sharing, they got married. Chopin had 3 sisters: Ludwika, Isabella, and Emilia. Frédéric received a fine education, and his musical gifts were apparent from a very early age. He received piano lessons from Wojciech Grzywny, a fine all-round musician who was able to help offer musical guidance and discipline in fundamentals, but readily admitted the boy had already surpassed him as a pianist almost from the beginning. Years later, Nicholas wrote to his son, "The mechanics of playing took you little time. It was your mind, not your fingers, that needed to be kept busy." Like Mozart, Mendelssohn, and Camille Saint-Saëns, Chopin was a prodigy. His first recognized composition was the Polonaise in G minor, written at age 7 and published posthumously. Even in this first composition, we see Chopin's personal and highly expressive style emerging within a rather classical framework. Let's hear some perspective on that from a pianist of the highest order and a great interpreter of Chopin, my friend and colleague Adam Niemann.
Chopin, for me, is an incredibly important composer, not just speaking as a pianist, but just as a musician. You know, there's the old Greek myth of Athena springing fully formed out of the head of Zeus. I think of Chopin very much that way, in the sense that there are very few composers who, from their very first notes, exhibited total originality, a completely new way of thinking about music and expression that really didn't shift or change. It deepened and it broadened, but it never really changed in its nature. When you look at the music of Chopin, let's say his earliest works, you see already the signature style, you see the sense of Polish identity, you see the pushing of the boundary of what musical expression was all about, kind of shifting out of a formalist point of view into something very personal, very first person. I think these are some of the things that identify Chopin immediately to the listener. And having spent time in Poland, having spent time in France, where he spent time in his summers, I had the privilege of growing close to some of the places that were very special to him. And these places really resonated with me too. I could see him in those places creating, being a part of the incredible circle of, you know, the Parisian music scene of the 1830s and early 40s, with its incredible creation and pushing of boundaries in every artistic way possible.
Chopin made his first public performance at the age of 8 in a now unknown concerto. His deep love of opera began in his youth. At the age of 10, the acclaimed soprano Angelica Catalani gave Chopin a gold watch inscribed to him that he treasured the rest of his life. For 2 years as a teenager, Chopin studied with Joseph Elsner, head of the Warsaw Conservatory, before formally enrolling for the 3-year curriculum. At the conservatory, Chopin was exposed to the rigors of composition in many forms and genres, but nothing could supplant his love for the piano. In fact, every piece he ever composed is for solo piano or a piano with instruments. In an official report card, Chopin was recognized as a musical genius. His teacher Elsner had hopes of Chopin becoming the great national composer of Poland who would write a fine Polish opera. Despite his love of opera, Chopin never composed one. He did not write much vocal music, but he did compose 19 Polish songs. Let's listen to one of these songs. Now, Josephine will be singing in German, And you'll see the translation with the song.
Durch die Taube streiten, fließen Menschenheeren, Hirten Glocken läuten, frohe Lerchen schweren, golden strahlt die Sonne, grün sind Wald und Traum, heute Frühlingswonne, regt den Nebelschaum. Ich nur einsam klage, unter Blütenflieder, alte süße Tage ziehen vorbei mir wieder. Alte süße Lieder sing ich in den Wind, von der Wonne nieder, Tränen auf Tränen rinnt. Lass dein frohes Singen, klare Lächeln droben, auf den schnellen Schwingen, trag mein Lied nach oben. Weiter, immer weiter, schwinge dich im Chor, bis wir ewig weiter schwebt der Himmel dort. Dorthin bring mir Blumen, die vom Himmel steht, wie in Tagesgrube klagen sie mein Lied.
Various private salons soon sought this budding genius, and Chopin thrived in the environment of literature and elegance. Chopin was exposed to Polish folk music, and this informed two types of the piano works that are most reflective of his homeland: the Polonaise, of which he wrote 27 in his lifetime, and the Mazurka, of which he wrote 51. Let's listen to one of the latter, played by my mother-in-law, Paula Frautmann-Stoppelenberg. In 1828, one of the greatest pianists of the age, Johann Nepomuk Hummel, visited Warsaw, followed in 1829 by Niccolò Paganini. Hearing these renowned musicians pushed Chopin to develop his own skills as a performer. His first major public concert was on March 17, 1830, and it included the Second Piano Concerto and his Fantasia on Polish airs. The tremendous reaction to this concert necessitated that he repeat the program 5 days later. A notice following the concert reflects the joy he brought to his listeners. More than once, these tones seem to be the happy echo of our native harmony. Chopin knows what sounds are heard in our fields and woods. He has listened to the song of the Polish villager. He has made it his own and has united the tunes of his native land in skillful composition and elegant execution. Chopin began to feel he had exhausted the potential of his native city. He did leave Poland to make performance tours to Germany, Austria, and Italy, and was well received as a brilliant young performer who improvised engagingly on Polish folk songs. Yet he longed to seek his fortune abroad. There was a chance he could have come to the United States. His mother's brother, or his uncle, Włodzimierz Krzyżanowski, was in the States and served as a general for the Union in the Civil War. The one thing holding Chopin back from leaving Poland for good, besides the ongoing political troubles there, was his love for a singer named Konstancja Gladowska. By all accounts, Chopin was in love with Konstancja, and before he left Poland, he gave her a ring. Let's listen to this song by Chopin that rather closely reflects his own experience with a ring and Gladowska.
Warst ein Kind noch, als ich wollte, dich schon Bräutchen neckte, und ein Ringlein dir von Golde an den Finger steckte. Als ich dann nach vielen Jahren von dir schied aufs Neue, da gelobtest du zu wahren, Ringlein mir und Treue. Da gelobtest du zu wahren, Ringlein mir und Treue. Und ich kehrte aus der Weite, flog lang Hochzeitsreigen, und eines andern Seite sah ich dich, mein Eigen. Reichtest mir die Hand zum Grusse, die mein Ring noch schmückte, ach, mit tränenvollem Kusse ich ans Herz sie drückte, ach, mit tränenvollem Kusse ich ans Herz sie drückte.
In 1832, 2 years after Chopin ultimately left Poland, Gladowska married Joseph Grabowski and went on to have 5 children with him. While we cannot know for sure if Konstancja reciprocated Chopin's feelings for her, there is one little clue that she was at one point asked by her daughter-in-law if she regretted not marrying Chopin, and that gives us at least some idea of the significance their relationship had had. One thing we can say for sure is that Chopin's love for Konstancja helped bring about one of his most famous pieces, the beautiful slow movement of his Second Piano Concerto. About Konstancja, Chopin wrote to a friend, "I may already, for better or for worse, have met my ideal, to whom I have faithfully served for 6 months now. She is the one I dream of, and for whom I dedicate the Adagio from my concerto." So let's listen to the first part of this movement, actually entitled Larghetto, from the Piano Concerto No. 2, in a quintessentially beautiful performance by Chopin's compatriot Arthur Rubinstein. I'm really sorry not to play the whole exquisite movement, but you can see it all on YouTube if you wish. Let's take a look at the 6 works Chopin composed for piano and orchestra. You'll see the 2 piano concertos that we call number 1 and number 2, and then 4 other concert works for piano and orchestra. And you'll note that Chopin composed both his piano concertos before the age of 20 and all before leaving Poland. Here's what Chopin looked like when he was writing these pieces that are now staples of the repertoire. A charming work that preceded his concertos is the 34-minute concert work, Variations on Mozart's duet La Ci darem la mano, composed by Chopin at the ripe old age of 17. As you'll see, it combined Chopin's love for opera with his love for the piano. Now, you liked that, right? The piece is so appealing, one wonders why it does not get programmed more often, especially, say, on a concert that ends with a Mozart symphony on the second half. I think it could be quite nice. Again, I think Adam Niemann has a good perspective on why Chopin gravitated to composing in shorter forms. Adam?
He did write, of course, large-scale works. He wrote 2 beautiful concertos and a cello sonata and 3 piano sonatas, which are large-scale, but Chopin is most identifiable for his miniatures, which is where he's able to express sort of the greatest poetry. So I think that a musician who feels a connection with the miniature, with character work, with connecting with sort of momentary emotion and more fleeting thought can find something in Chopin's music that's ephemeral and incredibly evocative.
I think Adam is right on the money. This may help explain why Chopin started a 3rd concerto before he died, but never finished it. He ultimately did not augment any of those youthful works for piano with orchestra. The final concert Chopin ever gave in his homeland was on October 11, 1830, and it included the concerto now referred to as number 1 in E minor, which was actually written after the concerto we call number 2. Writing to a friend, Chopin said about this E minor concerto, "Here you doubtless observe my tendency to do wrong against my will, as something has involuntarily crept into my head through my eyes. I love to indulge it, even though it may all be wrong." I think what he was referring to here is his tendency to emphasize feeling over traditional form. After many tearful farewells, Chopin left Poland for good in November of 1830 and decamped to Vienna, where he remained for almost 8 months. While there, he learned much and composed, but he did not find the same warm reception he had previously in that city. Revolution broke out in Poland, which was highly distressing to Chopin. People like to say that Chopin wrote his revolutionary etude as a response, though this does not have historical justification. He decided to depart for London by way of Paris, but of course, the latter city was to become his home for the rest of his life, meaning for the next 18 years. At the top of the heap of Parisian pianists was Frédéric Chopin, to whom Chopin ultimately dedicated his first piano concerto. As he had done in Warsaw, Chopin came up through the various private salons, gaining admirers along the way. One of his admirers, who herself had many admirers, was the Countess Delphina Potocka. Chopin was said to worship the ground she walked on, and for her, he composed a waltz. I'd be happy to play a recording for you if you have a minute. There's nothing like watching Lang Lang play. Chopin gave his first public concert in Paris in 1832, a program he shared with Kalkbrenner. It had to be delayed 4 days because Kalkbrenner was ill. A review of this first Paris concert given on February 26, 1832 said, "If not a complete renewal of piano music, at least part of that which we have so long sought in vain, namely an abundance of original ideas of a kind to be found nowhere else." Chopin quickly moved to the top of Parisian artistic life, hobnobbing with such luminaries as Liszt, Berlioz, Bellini, and Meyerbeer. He soon supplanted Kalkbrenner as the most in-demand of piano teachers. Chopin was not the blazing public virtuoso like Franz Liszt, but he found he could do quite well through his private connections, sustaining himself through teaching and the sale of his music. It is remarkable that in 18 years in Paris, he only gave 30 public concerts. In fact, Chopin gave no concerts at all for a 10-year period, from 1838 to 1848, yet his fame only increased as a composer. This was underscored in the writings of Heinrich Heine, who praised Chopin in particular for being above the many piano virtuosos who vied for public attention, often through increasingly flamboyant antics. Now, his relationship with Franz Liszt bears further mention. The two appear to have been frenemies, rivals, sometimes vindictive and sometimes cordial. Both of them were supreme virtuosos at the piano, but while Liszt was the ever-flamboyant matinee idol, Chopin eschewed this course to be true to his own authentic muse. Liszt can rightly be described as the Paganini of the piano, while Chopin was the poet of the piano. Probably more than any other composer of his day, Chopin possessed an extraordinary sense of the coloristic possibilities of this instrument. Of course, we should remember that the piano of the middle 19th century was very different than the modern piano, and yet Chopin had an unerring sense of what could be achieved with that instrument. In this sense, he was to the piano what I would say François Couperin was to the harpsichord, and even Maurice Ravel was to the modern symphony orchestra. I guess it's hard to beat the French when it comes to color. Of Chopin, Liszt said, "His character was indeed not easily understood. 1,000 subtle shades, mingling, crossing, contradicting, and disguising each other, rendered it almost indecipherable at first view. Like the twisted folds of a serpent rolled upon itself, the feelings are half hidden, half revealed." Upon arriving in Paris and hearing Liszt, Chopin, for his part, said Liszt was a zero compared to Kalkbrenner. Johann Joachim, the great violinist and friend of Brahms, came to Weimar to be concertmaster of the orchestra conducted by Franz Liszt. Joachim left the position after just 2 years, but offered a telling recounting of playing chamber music with Liszt. He said that the first time playing the music was very satisfying, but on the second pass, Liszt would start to change harmonies or make ordinary trills into sixths or add octaves or thirds to simple passages. In other words, Liszt could not stop composing, even in other people's music. It was precisely this tendency that soured the relationship between Chopin and Liszt. Chopin dedicated his first set of etudes to Liszt, and Liszt played them often, but in his own way and sometimes with different notes. This did not please Chopin. Of his contemporaries, there was just one pianist that Liszt considered to be his technical superior, and that was the French pianist Charles Alcan. Liszt said that Alcan had the most perfect technique of any pianist alive. On his deathbed, Chopin gave his unfinished treatise on piano technique to Alcan to complete. Alcan had many personal issues, and his time in the public limelight waxed and waned. He ultimately immersed himself in Talmudic studies, and in 1888 died an unusual death when he was crushed by an enormous bookcase after reaching for an old Talmud on the top shelf. In Paris, Chopin associated with fellow Polish expats displaced by the revolution, and also was acquainted with a variety of the leading artists of the day, including the writers Delacroix and Balzac. He became a French citizen in 1835. Chopin had several romantic relationships, but the most famous was with the novelist Amantine Lucille Aurore Dupuy, known more famously as George Sand, whom he met in 1836. By 1838, when their liaison was in full swing, George Sand and Chopin went to Majorca in hopes of Chopin's health improving a bit in the sunnier climate. Things were strained between Sand, Chopin, and Sand's children, whose side Chopin would often take in family disputes. But he managed to be very productive in this time. It was during the stay in Majorca that Chopin completed one of his most important works, the 24 Preludes, Opus 28. Inspired by J.S. Bach's Well-Tempered Clavier, Chopin wrote in all the major and minor keys. But whereas Bach presented his sequence chromatically in ascending order, Chopin constructed his on the circle of fifths. This is the set that includes this famous short prelude in A major that I have no doubt that you'll recognize. If there is one feeling that runs through Chopin's music, it is that of longing. Longing for a distant homeland, longing for lost loves. We certainly hear that in his nocturnes, of which he composed 21 for the solo piano. Towards showing the intimate personal expression that courses through Chopin's shorter piano works and the sense of longing, I'd like to play the Nocturne Opus 32, number 1, in B major. It's one of my favorite pieces in his output. The son of George Sand, Maurice, increasingly objected to Chopin's presence in their lives, and finally, in 1847, a complete break came. Revolution in France made it impossible for Chopin to teach, and he accepted an invitation from his student Jane Stirling to visit England and Scotland. It was Stirling who provided much financial support to Chopin in the last 3 years of his life. His health deteriorated. Stirling helped provide an apartment for him to live in at Place Vendôme, where he would ultimately pass away. Chopin wanted a member of his family to be near him, and Stirling helped arrange for his sister Ludmika to come. This is a daguerreotype taken of Chopin in 1849, the year he died. One of Chopin's closest admirers was the singer Pauline Viardot. Viardot wryly remarked that while Chopin was abandoned by many as his health declined, for grand Parisian ladies it became de rigueur to faint by his bedside. After Chopin died, Viardot was one of the soloists in Mozart's Requiem, which was performed at his funeral. On October 16, 1849, a doctor asked Chopin if he was suffering greatly, to which the composer replied, "No longer," and he passed away early in the morning of the next day at 2 a.m. He was 39 years old, still a young man. Similarly, Mozart was 35 when he died, Mendelssohn 38. Chopin's funeral at the Church of La Madeleine in Paris was a ticketed event. 3,000 people came from all over Europe, and many were turned away. At the graveside, an arrangement of his famous funeral march was played. At his request, his heart was removed and preserved in cognac and taken back to Warsaw the next year by his sister. An article published in the American Journal of Medicine in 2017 reported that an examination of Chopin's heart in 2014 revealed signs of pericarditis brought about most likely by tuberculosis. Sometime later, Ludmika found some 200 letters from Chopin to George Sand. The letters were returned to Sand, who unfortunately destroyed them. One piece played in Chopin's funeral was his prelude in B minor, Opus 28, number 6. And I would like to end with that. Sylvester and I would like to thank you for listening again to this lecture about Frédéric Chopin. Thanks very much and stay well.